On March 25, 1964, New York City moved with its usual restless rhythm, but Harlem carried a different kind of electricity that night. The streets were alive with jazz spilling from clubs, the smell of hot food drifting through the air, and whispers of big names passing through the city. Among them was a young heavyweight boxer whose name was beginning to echo across America, Cassius Clay. Clay had just arrived in Manhattan after a public appearance, his confidence as sharp as his smile. He wasn't yet the legend the world would later know, but Harlem already saw something special in him. That evening, he was invited to a private club downtown, a place where power didn't wear uniforms, it wore tailored suits and spoke in low voices. The club was controlled by the Italian mob, a territory where respect was demanded, not given. Inside, laughter filled the room until Clay walked in. Some men looked at him with curiosity, others with quiet contempt. He was young, bold, black, unapologetically proud, everything the mob despised. When Clay passed near a table of powerful mob figures, one of them smirked and spoke loudly enough for the room to hear. "Look at this kid," the man said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Someone teach this boy how to behave." The word hit harder than any punch. For a moment, the room froze. Clay felt the insult burn under his skin, but he didn't react. He straightened his jacket, lifted his chin, and walked out with dignity. Yet, outside the club, Harlem's ears were already listening. News traveled faster than bullets in those streets. By midnight, the story reached a quiet apartment in Harlem where Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, sat alone, reading a newspaper under dim light. Bumpy was not loud. He did not rush. He listened. When one of his men told him what had happened, Bumpy slowly folded the paper and looked up. His eyes were calm, but something in them changed. They called him. "What?" he asked. "Boy," the man replied. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He simply stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over Harlem as if he were studying a battlefield, only he could see. "Disrespect is expensive," he said quietly, "and by morning, they'll understand the price." Outside, Harlem continued to breathe, unaware that a line had been crossed and that the night had just begun. By the next evening, Harlem felt different. The streets looked the same. The air carried tension that only experienced men could sense. Bumpy Johnson did not rush into action. He understood something the mob never fully grasped. Real power moved silently before it struck. On March 26, 1964, just after sunset, Bumpy walked through Harlem without bodyguards, his long coat swaying gently with each step. People nodded respectfully as he passed. Shop owners, musicians, hustlers, and elders all watched him with quiet understanding. They knew when Bumpy walked like that, something serious was happening. Inside a small back room behind a bar on 125th Street, Bumpy met his closest men. The room was dim, filled with cigarette smoke and low voices. Maps of Manhattan lay on the table, marked with notes and names. Every detail of the mob's territory had been studied. Clubs they owned, routes they controlled, men they trusted. "They think Harlem is loud," one of Bumpy's men said. "They don't know we listen." Bumpy tapped the table slowly, his eyes scanning the information. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. To him, the insult wasn't just about Cassius Clay. It was about respect, identity, and the unspoken rules of the streets. If the mob could humiliate a rising black champion publicly, it meant they believed Harlem had no voice. Across town, the mob was celebrating. In their world, the incident was nothing more than a joke. They laughed over drinks, convinced that Harlem would remain quiet, just as it always had when challenged by their power. They didn't see the invisible lines being drawn around them. Meanwhile, Cassius Clay sat alone in his hotel room, staring at the city lights outside his window. The insult replayed in his mind, but something else troubled him more. The rumors he had begun to hear. People whispered that Bumpy Johnson had taken the matter personally. Clay knew the name. Everyone did. Bumpy wasn't just a man, he was a force. Late that night, a messenger arrived at Bumpy's apartment. He spoke softly, delivering updates from downtown. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When the man finished, Bumpy nodded once. "Good," he said. As the city drifted toward midnight, Harlem remained strangely quiet. No sirens, no gunshots, no chaos. But beneath the silence, something powerful was forming, like a storm gathering strength before it breaks. The mob thought the danger had passed. They were wrong. On March 27, 1964, New York woke up under gray skies as if the city itself sensed what was coming. While the streets bustled with ordinary life, the underworld moved according to a different clock. For Bumpy Johnson, the moment had arrived, not for violence yet, but for something far more dangerous, a message. That afternoon, a well-dressed man walked into one of the mob's favorite clubs in Midtown. He wasn't nervous, wasn't aggressive, and didn't look like trouble. He ordered a drink, waited patiently, and asked to speak with the club manager. When the manager arrived, the man leaned closer and spoke in a calm voice. "Mr. Johnson sends his regards," he said. "He'd like a conversation." The manager's smile faded. Within hours, word reached the mob's inner circle. They were not accustomed to being summoned, especially not by a Harlem figure. Some of them laughed it off, calling it arrogance. Others, older and wiser, felt a quiet unease. They remembered stories about Bumpy Johnson, stories that never made newspapers but lived in whispers. That night, in a private room above a quiet restaurant near Harlem's border, the meeting took place. Bumpy arrived alone, wearing a dark suit and a hat pulled low over his eyes. The mob representatives were already there, seated comfortably, as if they owned the place. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Bumpy removed his hat and sat down slowly. "You insulted a man," he said, his voice low and steady. One of the mobsters shrugged. "Your boxer friend. It was nothing. Just words." Bumpy looked at him without blinking. "Words build empires," he replied, "and words destroy them." The room grew colder. Another mobster leaned forward, smirking. "You're making threats, Johnson." Bumpy smiled faintly, but his eyes were serious. "No," he said, "I'm offering clarity." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "In Harlem, respect is not optional. You crossed a line you don't see yet. By morning, you'll understand where it was." The mobsters exchanged glances. They expected shouting, demands, maybe violence. Instead, they saw a man who seemed completely certain of his power. That certainty disturbed them more than anger ever could. Bumpy stood up, placed his hat back on his head, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned once more. "You still have time," he said quietly. "But time doesn't wait for anyone." As he disappeared into the Harlem night, the mob remained seated in silence. For the first time, laughter did not return to their table. Somewhere in the city, Cassius Clay felt a strange chill he could not explain, and the countdown had begun. On the night of March 27th, 1964, New York City glittered as always, but beneath the lights, fear began to move like a shadow. The mob had dismissed Bumpy Johnson's warning with forced confidence, yet uneasiness crept into their conversations. Phones rang more often than usual. Trusted men reported strange movements in Harlem. Old alliances felt suddenly fragile. As midnight approached, Bumpy sat quietly in a Harlem apartment, listening to jazz playing softly on the radio. Around him, his closest men waited in silence. There was no shouting, no dramatic speeches. Bumpy believed that real power didn't announce itself. It arrived unexpectedly. At 2017 M, the first signal came. One of the mob's supply routes in Harlem stopped operating without explanation. Drivers disappeared, vehicles were abandoned, and businesses that secretly paid protection money suddenly refused to cooperate. It wasn't violence, it was disruption. The mob felt their control slipping, piece by piece, like sand through their fingers. Across Manhattan, a mob lieutenant stormed into a private office, furious. "Johnson is testing us," he said. "He thinks he can embarrass us without firing a shot." But another man, older and more experienced, remained silent. He had seen this pattern before, decades ago, when Bumpy had quietly dismantled rivals without leaving obvious evidence. By 1:40 M, rumors spread through the mob's network that certain insiders had switched loyalty. Names were whispered. Doubt spread faster than fear. Men began questioning each other's loyalty. Old friendships cracked under suspicion. Meanwhile, Cassius Clay stood on a balcony overlooking the city, unaware of the full scale of what was happening, but sensing that something bigger than himself was unfolding. The insult that had seemed like a single moment of humiliation had become the spark for a hidden war. At 20:30 A.M., Bumpy finally stood up from his chair. He walked to the window and looked over Harlem, where streets were unusually quiet. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. "They're starting to understand," he said calmly. Outside, the mob's world was collapsing, with gunshots, but with fear, betrayal, and uncertainty. They realized too late that Bumpy Johnson had not come to negotiate. He had come to rewrite the balance of power. As dawn approached, the city held its breath, and the mob understood one terrifying truth. The morning would not bring peace, it would bring consequences. On the morning of March 28, 1964, the sun rose over New York with deceptive calm. To ordinary people, it was just another day. But in the underworld, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The mob had survived wars before, yet this time felt different. There were no public shootouts, no headlines, no obvious enemies, only the slow realization that their grip on Harlem had weakened overnight. By 70 M, reports flooded into mob headquarters. Businesses that once bowed to them were now refusing cooperation. Informants stopped answering calls. Trusted partners hesitated before speaking. Every conversation carried suspicion. The mob leaders understood something painful. Bumpy Johnson had not attacked them directly, he had outmaneuvered them. In Harlem, People whispered Bumpy's name with renewed respect. To them, he wasn't just a crime boss, he was a symbol of dignity in a world that rarely offered it. The insult against Cassius Clay had become a turning point. Harlem saw it not as revenge, but as a statement. Humiliation would no longer be tolerated. Cassius Clay heard the stories later that morning. He sat quietly, listening to the details he never expected to learn. He realized that the streets had fought a battle he never asked for, yet somehow it had been fought in his name. For the first time, he understood the deeper meaning of respect, not just in boxing arenas, but in history, identity, and power. Across town, the mob gathered in silence. No one laughed anymore. They replayed the meeting with Bumpy in their minds, finally understanding his words. He hadn't threatened them. He had warned them. One of the mob leaders spoke softly, his voice stripped of arrogance. "Johnson didn't want a war," he said. "He wanted us to remember who owns Harlem." Back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson walked through the neighborhood as usual, hands in his coat pockets, expression calm. People greeted him with quiet nods. He didn't boast. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. He had made his point. By the end of the day, the mob had learned a lesson that no violence could have taught them. Power wasn't always loud, and fear wasn't always visible. Sometimes, the most dangerous man was the one who spoke softly and acted precisely. And from that day forward, whenever someone mentioned Harlem, one name was spoken with caution, respect, and fear: Bumpy Johnson.